The maiden summit between Presidents Yoon-Suk-yeol and Joe Biden has wrapped up. As expected, the duo discussed various issues while reaffirming the alliance between the two countries. Arirang News is continuing our special coverage through the night. To help us go through the historic session's details and shed light on future diplomatic directions, we have Mason RICHEY, Professor of International Politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Professor, it's great to have you with us again.
Great, happy to be here.
Well, first of all, Professor, let's start with your overall take on the Yoon-Biden summit and the joint presser that we just watched.
Sure. So obviously, it seems like it went really well, which in many respects I think was to be expected. Yoon, as a conservative, and the people around him, have historically a very close relationship with the United States and place a lot of weight on building up the U.S.-ROC alliance. So surely in the preparations, which were in a very compressed time frame, of course, towards this, that came out, I think, and made it very easy for the two sides to work together. Park Jin, the foreign minister here, Kim Sung-han, the National Security Advisor, as well as his deputy Kim Tae-hyo, and others in the administration have a real reservoir of trust in Washington. So I think it made things easy to put together in a very short time frame. So I think despite the challenges, including, of course, moving the executive office away from the Blue House, the agenda was able to be very well prepared despite its enormous level of ambition. And I think that's really the second part. It's extremely ambitious. It covers extended deterrence vis-a-vis North Korea. It covers economic security. We heard an enormous amount about supply chain resilience and economic security, especially involving advanced and advancing technologies. Obviously, human rights and values were important. The South China Sea came up. And you really saw the effort, I think, by the Yoon administration to place some emphasis on trying to cash in and make good on this promise to make South Korea a global pivotal state, as they talked about during the campaign. So I think the ambition really came through, and of course the United States is absolutely looking for that as it's wanting to work more with its allies and partners here, notably, of course, in the Indo-Pacific region. So I think it's extremely ambitious. That's for me, I think, kind of the second takeaway. And then the third thing I thought was kind of interesting in the presser itself, and that was how both Yoon and Biden, I think, in their own way and in a sort of sophisticated way, which probably says quite a bit about their advisors who prepared their remarks, tried to marry together some domestic political considerations with some international political considerations. And we saw that with Yoon, I think, where he talked about how, in terms of international relations between South Korea and the United States, obviously this has an international dimension to it, has an external relations dimension to it, but it also helps advance security here in Korea at home, which therefore also bolsters the basic foundation and framework for South Korea to be prosperous. And in Biden's case, we saw very clearly how he linked together the desirability of the United States as a partner, economically, by talking about how the United States has, perhaps going to have higher growth than China in upcoming years. Obviously that's important as a message to South Korea and other partners here in the region, but it's also an important message back home as we're going into the midterm election in the United States, because Biden and the Democrats are getting absolutely hammered on the economy at home, because even though growth is relatively solid, inflation is high, and there's a large amount of fear among the consumer base because of that inflationary note. So I think that there was an interesting way of trying to talk about how Biden's efforts at building relations abroad would reinforce an attempt to try to have a middle-class oriented economic policy with strong growth in the United States at home, which has an electoral dimension in the U.S.
Looks like the two leaders had great chemistry, and they both worked for each other as amplifiers in some sense, as you mentioned. This is the first time a Seoul-Washington summit has been arranged so quickly following the inauguration of a new South Korean leader. What are the key contributing factors to this rapid developments?
As I said, I think both teams have a reservoir of trust with each other. I think that's absolutely critical. So many of the people in the Yoon administration are well known in Washington, and of course, everyone in Biden's team in the White House and in the State Department, in the Defense Department, and in the Treasury Department are known in Seoul and among all the people who are surrounding Yoon. So I think that that made it really easy to rapidly roll out the agenda for the summit this time. The other thing is, I think we've had a real clarifying moment, I think, over the last now 3 months with Russia invading Ukraine. Where the changes to the international system, the changes to the international order, what we sometimes call the liberal international order or the international rules-based order, those changes and the threats that it represents both to peace and security, but also therefore to prosperity, I think have really clarified how important it is for partner countries, and in the case of the U.S. and South Korea, military allies, to work together. And I think that's sort of reduced the scope for the two countries to look abroad and perhaps think about dalliances with other countries. It's really focused, I think, how important it is to have trusted partners to work with. So again, that helps, I think, sort of immediately clarify what the most important priority items should be for the agenda for a summit like this.
Could you highlight some of the key standout achievements for the allies this time in this session?
So it's going to be a little bit banal, I think, as a first answer, but I think a definite standout achievement is simply that both President Yoon and President Biden had this summit, which apparently, as you mentioned, featured good chemistry between the two, and that took place early in Yoon's presidency, which means he's going to have a lot of running room to cash in over the next couple of years, at least when Biden's president. On the ambitious agenda that they've laid out. And it is very ambitious. I've only talked about a few of the things that are part of it. There's trilateral cooperation with Japan, there's cybersecurity, there's a South China Sea, there are human rights issues, both in the region and more broadly. Russia, Ukraine, which again I've barely touched and is obviously hugely important for Washington right now. So all of those items that we see in the readout, which is extremely long actually for a readout, provide areas where we're going to see working groups going forward between the two countries. And if they get even a third or a half of this done or make progress on that, that will already be fairly impressive. So I think that's one of the important things. And then at least from the a sort of give and take perspective, Yoon was able, clearly to communicate, and his team in advance of the summit was able to clearly communicate how important it was going to be to update the extended deterrence strategy and consultation group to get that going again, since it's been moribund since 2018 because of the evolving nature of the threat that North Korea represents. And that extended deterrence working group, of course, is comprehensive. It's talking about extended nuclear deterrence, but also missile defense. It's talking about conventional defense capabilities, and so updating and advancing that to meet the challenges of contemporary nuclear North Korea is important, of course, for South Korea's security and defense. And then on the Biden side, I think it was a real win for them to get the Yoon administration to sign on to this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF. Frankly speaking, without the rest of the world knowing really what's even in it, we know some of the pillars involving connectivity and digital governance and corruption and tax-related issues. But we don't really know many of the specifics on that. The policy hasn't really been formally rolled out, but it's a feather already in Biden's cap as he's going on to Tokyo in just a couple of days, or tomorrow, in fact, even, to have a Quad leaders meeting. And during that time in Tokyo, this IPEF is going to be rolled out somewhat more extensively. And having Yoon already sign on to that and, in fact, attend a rollout session of that apparently online, I think is a win for Biden because to some degree the United States has been very present here in the region diplomatically. It's been very present, obviously, in terms of its military partnerships and its military alliances, but ever since the United States pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and has not entered the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which followed the TPP that the United States pulled out of under Trump, the United States has sort of had a vacuum in terms of its economic policy here in the region. And at least in principle, IPEF is supposed to fill that. Whether it does is, of course, a separate question, and we don't know what that's going to look like going forward, but at least in theory, that's the idea.
Now, Professor, you have done numerous interviews with the members of the foreign press. Based on your interactions with them, What was their overall response like from the outside looking in at the summit and its results?
So to be totally honest with you, this morning I was actually out hiking, so I didn't really have a chance to talk with the members of the press too much. It was a beautiful day today, and I didn't want to just stay inside and sort of keep watching the news and basically not learn very much because we don't really know what's going on yet. But in my talks with members of the media in the last few days and in the last few weeks, I would say the standard narrative is a conservative is in office now. And that's going to naturally make things easier for the alliance, and in most respects that's true. And I think because of that, the expectations are fairly high. And at least to come out of this first summit, to look at the readout and to have seen the presser, I think that those expectations were met. Obviously, what's going to be interesting going forward is now that you've set this ambitious foundation and this ambitious agenda, are the working groups, are the senior official, levels and the working group levels that are going to have to cash in, all of the promises that are being made here and all of the elements that are on the table that could be realized to grow the alliance and to turn it, into this, more comprehensive partnership that will have an effect globally at helping to rebuild an international order which has been damaged by Chinese malfeasance and by the Russia-Ukraine war. Will those promises be kept going forward? And we don't know the answer to that, of course, and quite a bit could change in 2024 if Biden is not reelected or if he doesn't run and someone else comes in. And obviously, if a Republican wins, it could change enormously what the United States' approach to the region is, especially if that Republican is Trump. But at least in theory, we've got a couple of years now where they'll have a chance to advance some of these agenda items.
Right, they expected the relationship to take flight. It's a matter of flying and landing the plane from here on.
Exactly.
Looking at the joint statements, Professor, it covers an array of topics. In your opinion, what stands out among these issues that they've covered?
In terms of issues, obviously, as I mentioned, extended deterrence, I think, is stands out. I think most people probably are now sick of hearing the term supply chain resilience, economic security. Obviously, that's been mentioned over and over and over and over again. And I think in particular that represents the interests of the United States, which has made this extremely important. Frankly speaking, starting I think with what we've seen happen in China over the last 10 or 15 years with technology theft and international intellectual property theft, and then of course that accelerated with the Trump trade war, and then of course COVID showed that our supply chains globally were relatively fragile, or at least were not as resilient and robust as we thought they would be. So I think that economic security, that technological security angle is probably the thing that stands out the most, and probably is what gets the most, I think, time in the presser. Extended deterrence, as I mentioned, as well. And at least I would say a third thing where I think we can really expect something positive, perhaps not right away, but in the not too distant future, will be better or at least more solid attempts by Seoul to cooperate with Tokyo and to solve some of the differences there, so that this can set a foundation for better Seoul-Washington, Tokyo cooperation, which is a really important part of how Washington would like to address the challenges here in the region involving values, technology, defense and security, notably vis-a-vis China. And then I think the last thing I'll point out, and as I said, this is very ambitious, so it's only 4 out of 25 or 30 action items. Ukraine. We saw how the Ukraine-Russia issue came up in both the presser and also in several areas here in the summit readout. And I think there's a sense in which we're seeing how the Yoon administration is beginning to lay the stones perhaps to deeper involvement in that conflict, not only because it's the right thing to do because of values, but also because of the order building element that comes out of this. The Russian attack against Ukraine is not only an attack against Ukraine, it's an attack against principles of sovereignty and human rights that are important parts of the international liberal order as we've experienced it over at least the last 30 years. And so, Yoon's very clearly wanted to make an attempt to try to make South Korea more involved in that process. And I think that there's a sense in which we're kind of going back to the future. The sense of like making Korea more global again. Maybe under a Moon, there was at least the impression that South Korea was perhaps a little too peninsula focused. If we go back to the 2000s, that wasn't necessarily the case. I mean, under both Roh Moo-hyun and under Lee Myung-bak, South Korea was involved with the United States both in Iraq and also in Afghanistan. In really, I think, helping from the perspective of the U.S., build some of the order in the Middle East. It didn't work out very well, unfortunately, but at least that was the idea. And so I think there's a sense in which South Korea is trying to again globalize its foreign security and defense policy a little bit. So that stood out to me as well.
Well, the key focal point was economic security this time. They agreed to include cooperation on new frontier areas. What's the key motivation for Washington in forging such a partnership with Seoul?
Well, I think there's sort of two things, and one of them I think I've kind of highlighted already, but I'll come back to it because it's important. And that is, this technology security and supply chain resilience, has become really critically important for the United States, both, frankly speaking, from an external relations perspective, notably, vis-a-vis China. As I mentioned, it's frankly speaking, abuses of international trade ever since it entered the World Trade Organization in the early 2000s. Have over time eroded U.S. technological and industrial base in some respects, and so the United States is I think interested in trying to refocus investment and refocus interest in these sort of emerging important areas of industry and manufacturing, notably in high technology, and that has not only a security and defense dimension, especially with semiconductors and chips and artificial intelligence and quantum computing and these elements that will go into the future defense and security systems and will have an enormous impact on the relative balance of military forces between the U.S. and China as they continue their competition and rivalry here in the region and even globally, but also domestically in the U.S. I mean, this obviously also plays into issues of prosperity at home. High value added production, high value added and high income manufacturing in some areas, which of course can bring better jobs and higher income. So there's a domestic part of it that's important for the U.S. The second part of it is, of course, why South Korea? Because of course South Korea is a leader in some of these areas, right? Whether that be DRAM or NAND, notably as we saw Biden down at the Pyeongtaek Samsung facility yesterday. But also in other areas as well, including batteries, petrochemicals, and other areas as well. South Korea is a leader in some of these emerging technologies and emerging industries, and so obviously Japan is as well, Taiwan is as well, South Korea is, and so essentially getting South Korea on board with this way of looking at economic security in the region. Is really an important component of the overall economic strategy that the U.S. has, not only for the region, but also domestically.
There's growing rivalry between the two superpowers, the U.S. and China, of course. How will bolstering an alliance with the U.S. affect future ties with Beijing for South Korea?
Yeah, so this is obviously one of the most important questions that South Korea is going to be facing going forward. Traditionally, of course, the way that we kind of think of South Korea is that it's, if you will, sort of stuck in between the U.S. and China, in the sense that the U.S. is the the security partner, the security guarantor for South Korea, notably vis-a-vis North Korea, of course. While at the same time China is South Korea's largest trade partner, and that's not only important for South Korean exports to China and the large Chinese market, but also the other way. Important inputs and components into South Korea's industry here domestically come from China. China, of course, also has a history of economic retaliation against South Korea when it has chosen, notably in 2017 with the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System that was put in here in consultation with the US, of retaliating against South Korea for choosing its security dimension of its relationship with the US over some of its economic concerns vis-a-vis China. Obviously, South Korea fears this and would like to avoid this going forward. That's one of the reasons why supply chain resilience is an important part of South Korea's group of interests economically here in the region as well. Yoon has already broadcast the fact that clearly he's tending a little bit more towards the U.S. than towards China, and perhaps not only in terms of policy, but even also rhetorically, which might irritate Beijing. My take for the moment is that it looks like right now Beijing is on relatively good behavior. They sent Wang Qishan, at least superficially, a fairly high person here for and close to Xi Jinping for Yoon's inauguration, which to me looks a little bit like an olive branch going forward. In the second place, China has a lot on its plate right now, right? There's, the COVID issues that it's trying to solve, with a very poor vaccine apparently, and a COVID-0 policy, which doesn't really seem to offer much of an off-ramp for how to get back to, a normal, economic environment in many cities in China, and that's going to hurt China's growth going forward, and it's obviously going to make people unhappy there, not only because of the economic dimension, but also the restrictions and the lockdowns which continue. And then thirdly, going into this year, Xi Jinping's through a party congress, very likely to try to get himself named essentially to be leader for the foreseeable future and possibly even for life. So I think in between now and then, I think we can probably expect China to be on relatively good behavior simply because it's got a lot of things to worry about. Beyond that date, however, and looking forward into the future, I think we can expect China to not simply allow, if you will, or without putting pressure at least on South Korea, to do whatever South Korea would like to do vis-a-vis the U.S. alliance in the region, especially in areas that start to impinge on what China considers to be its vital interests. That's in the South China Sea, the Taiwan Straits, and obviously rhetoric and commentary involving China's domestic politics, notably in provinces like Xinjiang or Tibet. And so I think that at some point we can definitely expect China to push back hard. We're not exactly sure where the red line is going to be. It could be some of these economic issues and technology issues. It could be, again, missile defense systems. It could be trilateral cooperation between the U.S., Japan, and South Korea, notably if that might involve linking together of missile defense assets or intelligence sharing. But at some point we can expect China to push back. And I think the interesting question is going to be how hard is South Korea going to push back against China's pushback?
Right, we'll have to brace for the worst, but expect the best, hopefully, in the future with China and North Korea, of course. Before we let you go, lastly, moving forward, what can we expect from this conservative government in terms of diplomatic strategies?
So obviously, to some degree, that depends on which country you're talking about. I really expect that this administration really is going to try to cash in on its promise of being what it called during the campaign, South Korea as a global pivotal state. At the foundation for that, of course, is the U.S.-ROC alliance. And I think that they've laid that foundation stone here with this readout pretty successfully and with this summit pretty successfully. So I think, if this administration has the ability to do so, both domestically and in terms of international events, I think we can expect it to use that foundation of the alliance to indeed build its strategy in Southeast Asia, to be more involved in overseas development assistance, which is a global concern, to advance on green issues and climate change issues, which again is globally important, to reach out to other regions, especially Europe, for instance, and play more of a role in Europe. Right now, of course, that's probably going to be mostly within the context of Ukraine and maybe some counter-piracy cooperation and some other things like that. But I think we're going to expect this sort of more comprehensive foreign policy, not only in terms of actual policies, but also in terms of rhetoric. So I think we can expect that. The real question for every South Korean administration is, to what extent, is North Korea going to make that possible, right? North Korea always manages to make life difficult for South Korean administrations, which have to refocus attention and time and resources on Peninsula when perhaps they might be interested in growing their relationships externally. And of course, as North Korea continues perhaps towards a seventh nuclear test, as it possibly is going to be testing ICBMs, hypersonic missiles, perhaps submarine-launched ballistic missiles going forward, to what extent is North Korea going to get pulled back into a peninsular focus rather than a more global focus, especially if North Korea ends up engaging in some type of provocation like we saw in 2010 with the Yongpyong-do bombings or the Chonan corvette destruction. So North Korea, I think, is an issue. And the second thing for the Yoon administration is how much political capital is it going to have to spend on this ambitious agenda internationally, considering that it's going to have a very difficult time pressing forward on its domestic agenda since it doesn't have a majority in the National Assembly. Is that going to distract it and make it difficult for the Yoon administration to work towards this more globalized external relations policy? Or are the problems of domestic policy and looking forward to the National Assembly elections in 2024, which obviously Yoon would like his party to win, is that going to eat up a lot of time and energy and bandwidth among Yoon and all of his advisors? And we don't know the answer to that question yet either.
Right, to reach out more globally and to be more diplomatically active across the globe, it looks like we'll have to focus just as much on cross-border diplomacy and capital as you just mentioned. Professor Mason RICHEY, thank you so much for making time for us on this Saturday.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.